At the turn of the 20th century, the people of the United States had cause for confidence and optimism. New technologies had revolutionized the workplace and society. The economy was booming, and there was the potential for many to take part in growing prosperity. Yet along with progress came social, political, and economic inequalities for large segments of the population. American women took the opportunity to become an integral part in addressing these issues and played a significant role in initiatives to reform society. During the period known as the Progressive Era, which lasted from approximately the 1890s until the U.S. entered the First World War in 1917, women used their voices to push forward nationwide suffrage, decent housing, better public health, safer working conditions, and government reform. As women's roles and influence in society began to change, they were able to shed 19th century norms and expectations, and this new woman also reformed fashion so that it reflected a new self-image as well as suited her needs. Most fashions throughout the 19th century weren't suitable for women's increasingly active roles in society. However, in the 1890s, everyday clothing began to reflect an increasingly practical and even egalitarian spirit. Easy-to-wear garments such as the shirtwaist blouse and simple skirt became ubiquitous across the nation. Another universally popular daytime ensemble included the matching jacket and skirt combination known as the tailor-made. Sportswear became a growing segment of the garment industry as women increasingly participated in active and outdoor leisure, and the craze for bicycle riding saw women for the first time wearing bloomers, divided skirts, and men's-style jerseys, what we now call sweaters, in public. All these trends continued into the early 20th century. The change of clothing styles in the 1890s coincided with the beginning of the Progressive Era. By this time, industrialization of the United States was fully underway, as was America's Gilded Age, during which some families were able to amass great wealth. The gulf between rich and poor was vast, and reformers sought to rectify these social inequities. In 1890, photographer Jacob Riis published his book, How the Other Half Lives, which publicly exposed the housing conditions endured by immigrants living in New York tenements. Jane Addams, leader of the American Settlement House movement, opened Hull House in 1889 in Chicago, which provided health care as well as educational and job training opportunities for the poor. Thousands of women's clubs and organizations were set up in the late 19th century, many of which took on projects working for the greater good. By 1900, 5 million women were earning wages and made up 19% of the total labor force in the United States. Clerical jobs, once predominantly male, were increasingly available to women workers, and occupations such as nursing and teaching were now female-dominated. Women in the professions such as law and medicine still represented a small proportion of the female workforce, but their numbers were growing as a result of increasing opportunities in education, as well as a greater acceptance of women in traditionally male spheres. Although there was a dramatic division of labor based on sex, with women paid significantly less than men, the numbers of wage-earning women made them a force to be reckoned with. The garment and textile industries, which employed large numbers of women, were targeted as major areas of concern. Progressive activists took part in industrial strikes as organized labor used its numbers to fight against unethical and unsafe business practices. Journalists, who were referred to as muckrakers, investigated and exposed the conditions commonly experienced by workers, and especially addressed child labor in U.S. mills and factories. In a 1903 book, journalists Marie von Vorst and her sister-in-law Bessie exposed the unhealthy conditions they discovered when Marie worked undercover in a shoe factory in Lynn, Massachusetts. They describe a colleague as an untidy, degraded-looking creature long past youth. Her hands beggared description, their covering resembling skin not at all, but a dark blue substance, leather-like, bruised, ingrained, indigo-hued. Her nails looked as though they had been beaten severely. One of her thumbs was bandaged. "I lost one nail," she said, "rotted off." Many of the leaders in the progressive movement unfortunately overtly left women of color out of their crusades. Endemic racism of the time meant reformers neglected to include or address issues faced by non-white Americans. The majority of African American women in the early 1900s were employed in domestic service jobs and therefore largely excluded from labor reforms. The legacy of the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision of 1896 had enshrined the idea of separate but equal, which left Black women to establish their own professional and political organizations, such as the National League for the Protection of Colored Women in 1906, the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses, formed in 1908, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1909. By the turn of the century, an ideal of the modern American woman emerged who was independent, educated, and involved in social causes. She was dubbed the New Woman, a term which admittedly primarily represented white, middle, or upper-class women who were able to take advantage of newfound freedoms. The illustrator, Charles Dana Gibson, created the Gibson Girl character in the late 1890s to depict the epitome of the new woman, an all-American girl who was tall, slim, with a confident smile, abundant hair loosely pulled up in the pompadour style, and a wardrobe of fashionable clothes. The Gibson Girl was the animated version of a modern celebrity. The cartoons in which she appeared placed her in contemporary situations and often in control of her interactions with men, so she was a model to which women could aspire. The Gibson Girl's popularity stretched well into the first decade of the 20th century, as other illustrators copied her and advertisers borrowed her image. Real-life examples of women who lived up to the Gibson Girl ideal included the U.S. President's beautiful and independent daughter, Alice Roosevelt, who was often featured in the press and embodied the qualities of Gibson's creation. Gibson's sister, Josephine Gibson Knowlton, remembered, "My brother wanted to portray a typically American type. However, in doing so, he reinforced the idea that the new woman at the turn of the 20th century excluded large portions of the female population, particularly people of color." As America entered the 20th century, the prevailing shape of women's clothing paradoxically shifted away from the increasingly comfortable and practical garments which had emerged in the 1890s towards a silhouette that overemphasized an old-fashioned ideal of the female body. For both everyday and formal wear, women of the early 1900s adopted a flat front corset that pushed the bust forward and the hips back, creating an S-shaped torso. From around 1900 through to 1904, the bodice might also be bloused, meaning that fabric hung in a full droop shape over the waistline. Stand-up boned collars added to a stiff and military-like posture that, courtesy of the S-bend corset, included a tipped forward stance with the chest puffed out. Skirts were cut slim, often with a train or demi-train trailing behind, or with fabric pooling at the feet. Adding pads at the hips and bottom created the look of a comparatively small waist. American women of the early 1900s may have been trailblazers in their quest for societal change, but many of their fashions harkened back to the 19th century practices, which were restrictive and somewhat impractical. However, as the decade moved on, a more comfortable, practical style of everyday clothing did emerge. The death of the S-bend corset and the fading of the popularity of the Gibson Girl made way for skirts which rose to ankle length and were made roomier with large pleats. Bodices and shirtwaists were looser. The middle years of the decade ushered in a much plainer look without the exaggerated focus on the curves of the bust and the bottom. The fashionable shape became more hourglass, achieved with blouses, belted waists, and A-line skirts or princess dresses, an all-in-one dress which followed the contours of the body. This was a more conservative and down-to-earth approach to clothing, with the exception of the accompanying hats that came in a surprising variety of odd shapes, including tricorn styles, hats that looked like round dinner plates, and others that rose in dramatic scoops. Whereas the 1890s saw the bicycle craze impact women's ability to travel independently, the 1900s saw the introduction of the automobile, which revolutionized mobility for everyone. Auto registration in the U.S. grew from 8,000 cars in 1900 to over 458,000 by 1910. That same year, Henry Ford's first Model T rolled off the production line, retailing for $850. Although car ownership initially was a privilege limited to the wealthy few, excitement about the coming of the automobile was widespread. And even if one couldn't own a car, it was possible to have a photograph taken at the seaside in a mock automobile. One of the most popular tunes of 1905 was "Come Away With Me, Lucille, in My Merry Oldsmobile," and fashions which protected clothing from the elements, such as the long duster coat and the flat hat tied to the head with a chiffon scarf, were worn by any woman who was on the move. As America moved into the 1910s, fashion changed again, and there was a focus on all that was artistic and modern. In 1913, the International Exhibition of Modern Art, known as the Armory Show, introduced the American public to a revolution in the visual arts. In the same year, the Woolworth Building in Manhattan became the tallest building in the world and a model for future skyscrapers. Ragtime was one of the most popular forms of music mid-decade, and dance halls allowed young men and women to meet without supervision and practice the latest of many dance crazes, including the foxtrot and the tango. The tango craze was so widespread, its influence reached into the world of international fashion. European designers held tango teas in their ateliers, where customers were invited to watch female models dance with each other, wearing slinky dresses with long slits in the skirt. The shorter length skirts revealed tango shoes, which crisscrossed over the foot and tied at the ankle to keep them in place. By this time, the U.S. was following the lead of Parisian fashion houses, with skirts becoming slim and the waist rising to just below the bust in the Empire style. Dramatic headdresses with vertical sprouting feathers and ribbons also came out of Paris's Directoire revival fashion trend and became associated with the tango look. The professional dance team Irene and Vernon Castle became stars of the stage and screen on the back of the booming enthusiasm for dance, and Irene became a fashion icon. The designer Lucille remembered Irene as the first of the moderns. Her slim, almost boyish figure and her sleek bobbed head — her hair had originally been cut off after an illness and she always kept it short afterwards — set a new standard which other women imitated. It was during the 1910s that the word feminism became commonly used to represent the principles of female economic, political, and sexual independence. Greenwich Village in New York City became a center for feminists who were freely living alternative lifestyles and discussing topics ranging from suffrage to open marriage. In 1912, a women-led group called the Heterodoxy Club was formed to meet up regularly in a village restaurant and allow members to openly discuss women's issues, including the significance of fashionable clothing. Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote that fashion was a social product, which was mainly modified to the arbitrary demands of this play world. She argued in the Forerunner Journal that, unlike men, women had not reached a point where they could dress in a way suitable to their daily occupations without being considered dull or unattractive. Perkins Gilman noted, "No one calls swans, greyhounds, or swallows monotonous because they dress alike. Woman, no matter what form of labor she was expected to follow in the home, found her main line in economic advantage in pleasing man." Other notable figures in the Greenwich Village circle pushed the boundaries of fashion simply by exercising their freedom to dress as they pleased. These trailblazers had a taste for peasant-style embroidery, batik textiles, and sandals. Photographs show them in bob haircuts, wearing Fortuny-style loose gowns, smock dresses, and trousers. Progressive activists continued their fight for the rights of women wage earners throughout the 1910s. Protests against unsafe working conditions came to a head after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire on March 25, 1911 in New York. Employing mostly women workers to make shirtwaists for an average of $6 a week, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company saw their building engulfed in flames when a fire was fueled by oil-soaked rags, dust, and clutter littering the work areas. The exits from the building were locked to prevent employees from stealing materials, so many died trapped in the building or from jumping out windows. Most of the 123 women killed were immigrants and between the ages of 14 and 23. In total, 146 people died, making it one of the deadliest industrial disasters in the United States up until that time. Yet the factory owners were acquitted of wrongdoing. Shortly after the Triangle Fire, strikes broke out at many of the shirtwaist factories across the city. As a result, workers were given slightly higher wages. However, in a 1912 Good Housekeeping article, labor rights activist Clara Lemlich, who worked as a shirtwaist maker, described the unhealthy conditions still common in garment factories. Lemlich noted, "I think the women who buy and wear the beautiful clothes do not know how it is for the girl who makes them, what conditions she has, or they would care and try to help her." The growing influence of women in political, social, and economic arenas seemed to make the prospect of women's suffrage inevitable at last. Women increasingly had the vote in individual states, but activists continued to apply political pressure to obtain nationwide suffrage. In 1910, the National Women's Political Union staged one of America's first large-scale suffrage parades in New York. Subsequently, parades were regularly scheduled throughout the decade, with one of the largest held in Washington, D.C. on March 3, 1913, the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. Suffrage activist Alice Paul and her National American Women's Suffrage Association organized the parade in the nation's capital to be staged as a pageant, opening on the steps of the U.S. Treasury building with women dressed as the allegorical figures of Columbia, justice, liberty, charity, peace, and hope. The parade procession was led by suffragist and society beauty Inez Milholland, riding a white horse and dressed as a warrior. Women in the Washington parade marched in groups representing states and suffrage organizations, with floats interspersed throughout. Some wore suggested colors such as yellow and white, while others adopted the colors of the British suffragists and chose white, purple, and green. One group walked from New York to Washington dressed in the garb of medieval pilgrims, wearing brown cloaks with hoods. African Americans were initially excluded from marching, as organizer Alice Paul believed racism would prevent white suffragists from participating in the parade. Ultimately, Black women's groups were included in the march, but they were consigned to the back of the parade and not listed in the official program. Alice Paul continued the fight for suffrage, and in 1917, she and other women activists, known as the Silent Sentinels, picketed the White House. Over 200 of these protesters were arrested, and 97 were sent to a workhouse in Occoquan, Virginia, where they suffered abuse and forced feeding at the hands of their jailers. In 1919, the National Woman's Party conducted a prison special lecture tour, during which the speakers wore clothing similar to the prison uniforms worn in the Occoquan workhouse. In 1919, the long fight for suffrage culminated in the passing of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which stated that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The 19th Amendment was finally certified in 1920. In the lead up to the United States joining the First World War, the roles of women in American society changed rapidly, and their fashions changed out of necessity. Uniform-inspired clothing included belted jackets and plain A-line skirts, with hems resting well above the ankles. Outerwear included capes or coats with a military look. Dresses were loose and practical. Clothing was often constructed with a relaxed fit, with pockets, belts, and buttons serving not only their utilitarian purposes, but also as decorative details. These straightforward styles moved everyday fashion in the direction of functional shapes and more minimalist design. The French fashion industry had all but shut down in the early years of World War I, but by mid-decade, Paris designers were back to producing and selling new collections, and in February of 1917, Vogue magazine reported that the shape of fashion was changing yet again, with the introduction of dresses with a barrel-shaped skirt, referred to as the chemise design. The cut of this dress was loose, with a soft belt and a skirt that widened at the hips and narrowed at the calf. The hem was the shortest yet, ending at mid-calf. The chemise dress's short and relaxed silhouette would last into the 1920s. The rise in the influence of designer Gabrielle Coco Chanel in the late 1910s further encouraged the demand for comfortable fashion. In her early career, Chanel opened boutiques in French seaside resorts and became well known for her sports and leisure wear. As early as 1917, she pioneered the use of jersey fabrics to produce garments with a simple and modern feel. Chanel was one of the first to lower the waist on her evening dresses and created the fashion for short, little black dresses. The enthusiasm for new and innovative looks had returned, and Chanel's styles ushered in an exuberant approach to fashion that lasted into the next decade. At the end of the war, Vogue magazine echoed what was to come. What is the new silhouette is once again the question of the hour. So again, the spirit of the mode, asleep since the Boche set his heavy foot upon the sacred soil of France, arouses itself and looks about. I've been asleep, it yawns. Let's see, what was I doing?